Los Guachimontones is an ancient settlement, one of the largest in western Mexico. It has this very up and down history of big population growth and decline, and that makes it a very interesting place to do archaeology and to study changing lifeways over time.
Since the world is now moving into a direction that is very hierarchical,
they provide a real counterpoint to the standard view we have of Mesoamerica.
I think a lot about how societies could have worked in the past.
The past was not just about setting up elites as dominating societies everywhere. Rather, things went a lot of different ways. The settlement as a whole has an occupation certainly of some 2,000 years, around 500 BC, right on up to probably the Spanish conquest of this region. Spatially, the settlement is broken into a central monumental core. This is where most of the large formal architecture can be found, with 9 or so Guachimontones of various sizes, 2 ball courts. As you move outwards from that central monumental core, it becomes more and more domestic, where you have more in the way of houses and terracing, probably for purposes of agriculture. It's important to place Los Guachimontones within the broader Tequila valleys. So the Tequila Volcano is at the very center of the valleys. And archaeologists like Lorenzo Lopez have argued that the Tequila Volcano may well be the origin concept for the sacred mountain in this region. Every Guachimontone has this central stepped altar that refers to a sacred mountain. And if you sort of think about the Guachimontone expanded to a regional level, the central altar sort of becomes the Tequila Volcano. The patio becomes the valley floors that surround it. And then the platforms on the outermost perimeter are then represented by the mountain ranges that enclose these valleys. This is really interesting both for how it represents the temple architecture, but that then is duplicated at other scales.
By looking at the art, we can understand what was important to the people who created these sites. Also, how Los Guachimontones was used. We have these multi-figure tableaus that take place on a circular structure with structures surrounding it. We can see that they were erecting poles in the center of these massive circular pyramids.
These are sort of classic representations in Mesoamerica of a concept called a sacred mountain and or a world tree. This temple is being built to represent the cosmos as it was understood by these people. The idea being that this is the center of the universe.
This architectural setup allows us to see this connection to all of these different realms and the way that people were trying to depict the different realms of the universe.
So this pole then seems to have been the central focus of rituals. Now, what is the pole? Well, we know in some areas of Mesoamerica, even today, they practice something called the Volador ritual, in which a group of very brave people climb up to the top, and they're attached by ropes to the top of the pole, and after they've played some music up there, they jump off the top of the little platform up there, and they spin slowly their way all the way down. So in that case, the Volador is very much a representation of the Mesoamerican calendar. You have 4 individuals making usually 13 circuits, adding up to a broader idea of sacred numbers in the calendar. For me, one of the major things I've worked on is the degree to which the architecture is associated with society, with social groups. There are usually 8 platforms around the perimeter of these Guachimontones. Excavations that we carried out in the year 2000, and then the excavations that Phil Weigand carried out from about 1999 to 2010 or so have actually found the same thing. Although the Guachimontone form seems very complete, it appears as a unit when you find it in the field, architecturally it's constructed piecemeal. Anthony DeLuca, for instance, studied Circle 2 here in great detail. And he found what we found in our excavations, that the platform is sort of one construction. The altar on the top of it is a separate construction. And then each of the buildings around the perimeter is built separately using often different construction techniques. It looks rather like each platform was built by a different group. All of this has suggested to me that these are different social groups. Maybe we call them families, maybe we call them lineages, but they're different social groups that are responsible for building the separate components of the architecture. And we actually see this in the ceramic models that portray the Guachimontones, because the superstructures and the designs painted on them, which we don't find archaeologically, they don't survive, but in the models, they're different designs, like different groups are representing themselves in different distinct ways. So you have not, let's say, one important dynastic lineage that runs society. That's kind of how we've portrayed Maya society, where you have a Maya ruler, they're seen as connected to the gods in very special ways. Their dynastic line is the line that controls the city's politics.
Los Guachimontones seems to have a more horizontal type organization rather than a vertical or hierarchical organization. There are no kings. We do have leaders. Was there warfare? Well, we have figures that speak of warfare, but was this a very volatile place? I don't think so. I mean, we have 700 years of occupation that perhaps was, I can't say it was peaceful, but it wasn't volatile as a segmentary state. Since this is an atypical place, and I say that in quotes because really what we haven't done is explore the atypical. It has characteristics that fit more of these collective types of organizations. And we don't really have a name to classify, but we don't have to have it. We just need to discover and explore how did it work, rather than say this is a state or a chiefdom or something else. Not everyone has to have kings, right? And we think that they should. Somebody has to be in charge. But we're finding examples that not really, maybe not.
In this region, if the altar in the center with a pole in it, if that is some important ritual that seems to be so critical, but no one family is really in a position to say, well, we're the ones who have this connection to the cosmos and no one else does. No, you seem to have what I would argue to be power sharing between multiple families, each of which probably has some sort of important role in ritual over the course of the year.
We're now developing new ways to study societies like this, and to be able to understand that not every single society has to work the same way. So that to me is exciting, because you're moving away from this ostentatious architecture or the artifacts and thinking more about how the whole society worked, how everyone collaborated or cooperated, and how we can see that in the architecture.
But there's one section that is a bit northeast of the central monumental core that's called Loma Alta. An analysis by Kimberly Sumano and Josh Engelhardt looked at things like how connected was the architecture. Are the open spaces, are they restricted? Let's say like in a kind of socio-political system where perhaps the elites were very much closed off from everybody else, certain areas could only be accessed by them. Or is it much more open and public? And their comparison did find some differences. On one hand, Both areas are relatively open, but the monumental core area with the biggest architecture is the most open section. If you think about it, each one is perforated by 8 passageways coming in between the platforms. So they're pretty open to anybody to come in and participate. What Josh and Kimberly found is that those tend to be a little more closed off. It has sort of been tweaked to where maybe this area could potentially have been of more limited access to the ritual or political elite that lived here at the site.
Chris and I have been talking about this a lot. How did these people organize themselves? Of course, we can see leaders, but that doesn't mean that we're despotic. That doesn't mean that we're forcing people to do anything, controlling people. Did people have more voice here than in other places? How can we see that? Did people have a better standard of living or not? So all of these things we can study here because we don't have this monumentality, ostentatious display of wealth, but we look at how is wealth distributed? Is there a big gap? If there's not, then something's going on there, right? And we can't just say, these are the rich people, these are the poor people, these are the people who have no voice, they have nothing, they don't really participate, they just work for the rich, right? Which has been, in a way, the way we thought about the past, you know? That the people have been a little bit invisible.
So the change that took place here around AD 500 is certainly a major transition in the overall history of this settlement.
You have a huge site, and then it gets reduced to a few little spots where people lived.
We see these major changes in architecture and ceramics and burial patterns and so on. But why? Well, we have a couple of competing ideas.
We have evidence for a natural disaster, perhaps a volcanic eruption that we haven't yet identified, the volcano.
To the west of here, we found that the region experienced a significant drought, one that had probably been progressing gradually over the first millennium AD. It's quite possible that that drought in some way triggered other changes, whether it was the collapse of what we had seen here previously.
If this really affected settlement pattern, but we think it did.
Or did it in some way trigger the movement of people into this region? Are these different explanations we proposed actually connected?
And our survey is finding places north of Los Guachimontones where people lived after that collapse.
Our current activities here at Los Guachimontones are really 2 different strands. Berenice Herreria and I have been looking at, on one hand, residential areas. Where did people actually live?
We know very little about settlement patterns before the Teuchitlan tradition. We want to know where people were living before Los Guachimontones was founded. So we're looking for early evidence of pre-Guachimonton settlement. The survey has helped us to identify potential places where people might have been living.
We've been mapping those, where they can be found around the site, and also excavations of those. So we've been looking at residential groups, and we find that they're commonly associated with agricultural terraces.
I never thought that we would find like all these terraces that we're finding like thousands of little terraces. They're pretty tiny, most of them.
These are terraces that are generally too narrow to put a house, but they are wide enough to, let's say, have a row of corn or maybe agave or some other sort of plants there.
So the settlement pattern it's kind of different from what we have seen in a large area.
So residences include, let's say, 4 houses around a little space. They may have a few other structures that may be for storage or for cooking. And we excavated one of these, and we've been finding that same kind of household group in a pretty wide area in and moving further and further away from Los Guachimontones. So what we used to think of as a more narrowly defined site is now turning out to actually have associated houses going further and further out. And that's probably why we have both a monumental sector of the site that has all these different Guachimontones, these circular temples, but we also find temples at greater distances, still further out. So you might think of it as being something like a city with the major cathedral, but maybe there are smaller churches in the surrounding areas moving further and further away that would have served a sort of a smaller population.
Finding all these settlements and then dating them relatively and seeing how people moved in the landscape throughout 2,000 years gives you a lot of information.
We really don't have an end to the site of Los Guachimontones in most directions still. We have elite lineages here that seem to have shared power, but each of those lineages was probably more broadly connected to the rest of that lineage out on the landscape. So people out in the landscape may have been more connected to the political centers. It wasn't like necessarily a total rupture between elites and everyday people. And broadening the sample of societies like that is really important.
Because sometimes we are in despair about the world, how the world is working now.
You don't have to propose something all utopian or anything to recognize that things can be less or more centralized and yet still function and may function better for their members.
Looking at these things from the past has shown that things can be different, that people can work together, and that people can actually make changes.
Expanding that database of societies that did not conform to maybe the way we envision the past to have been, it is very important to give us a richer view of the past and the ways in which society could be.